When I first started looking into the great train stations of the late 19th century, I thought I knew what I was going to find. I expected soot, steam, noise, and chaos. I expected to see the brutal beginnings of modern industry, coal-stained. Walls, exhausted workers, crude machines forcing a new world into existence. That is the image we are taught. That is the story repeated in textbooks, museums, and documentaries. But almost immediately, something felt wrong. The stations I found didn't look like the birthplace of an industrial age struggling to learn how to build. They looked finished, not experimental, not crude, finished, balanced, precise, calm. I remember staring at an early photograph of a European station from the 1870s and feeling a strange discomfort I couldn't explain. The building wasn't just old, it felt misplaced, as if it didn't belong to the time it was supposedly built in. The arches were too perfect, the symmetry too exact, materials too refined. This wasn't the aesthetic of desperation or trial and error. This was confidence. And then there was the glass. Vast glass domes stretched across platforms like the ceilings of cathedrals. Not thick, clumsy panes, but delicate repeating geometries that flooded the interior with light. Iron ribs curved with mathematical precision, meeting at exact points as if calculated long before a single stone was laid. Nothing about it looked improvised. Nothing about it looked temporary. The more stations I examined, London, Paris, Antwerp, New York, the more the same feeling returned. These weren't just transport hubs. It felt ceremonial, purposeful, almost reverent. Like spaces designed for something more than moving people from one place to another. And the strangest part was this: none of them felt built. They felt inherited. As I dug deeper, the official explanations began to repeat themselves with eerie consistency. The stations were products of the Industrial Revolution, built with steam power, constructed using the tools of the era. The glass-on-iron style was simply fashionable, a triumph of Victorian engineering. But that explanation never addressed the real question: how? How do you construct structures of this scale and complexity using nothing but steam engines, horses, pulleys, and hand tools? How do you curve iron ribs with such precision before modern cutting machines existed? How do you align foundations so perfectly that entire buildings remain stable more than a century later, despite constant vibration from trains and crowds? According to the official timeline, these stations were built before electric drills, before motorized cranes, before modern surveying tools. And yet, many of them outperform modern structures in durability, symmetry, and environmental control. That contradiction stayed with me. I started looking for construction records, blueprints, engineering notes, anything that explained the process. What I found instead was absence, missing plans, vague attributions, architects credited for facades and decorations, but almost nothing about the core structural systems. The heart of the building, the part that actually made it stand, was rarely explained in detail. It was as if the architects were decorating something that already existed. Old newspapers praised the beauty of the stations, but rarely described their mechanics. Engineering journals referenced systems without fully explaining them. Catalogs showed components without context. And when descriptions did appear, they often used the same phrases, copied word for word across different countries as if a template had been distributed and reused. That was the first moment I realized this wasn't just about architecture. Then I noticed something else, something almost everyone overlooks. Water, not fountains as decoration, not ornamental ponds. Systems everywhere I looked, beneath the platforms and behind the walls, there were signs of deliberate water engineering. Massive underground chambers, channels leading directly from rivers, pipes large enough to walk through, reservoirs hidden below station floors. These weren't emergency systems. They were too large, too integrated. Two central dots in London, early photographs show vaults beneath. Stations filled with water infrastructure. In Paris, underground maps revealed channels sealed off long ago. Their original purpose never explained. In Antwerp, Foundation records reference pressure systems that no longer exist. This wasn't random. This was design. The more I studied these layouts, the more they began to resemble something unfamiliar. Not buildings, machines. Stations weren't arranged like modern industrial spaces. They were symmetrical, layered, aligned. Platforms sat above cavities. Domes aligned with vertical shafts. Floors followed precise ratios. It felt as if every element was placed not just for strength, but for flow of people, flow of air, flow of water, and possibly flow of energy. That idea seemed absurd at first, but then the photographs started to tell a different story. Where was the soot? In a world supposedly powered by coal, these early stations looked impossibly clean. Ceilings weren't blackened. Ironwork wasn't coated in grime. Glass panels were clear, reflective, almost pristine. Even locomotives in early images often showed minimal exhaust, no thick smoke, no choking haze. Something didn't add up. I went back to the archives. Engineering journals from the 1860s and 1870s. And that's when I started seeing references that no longer appear in modern history books. Hydraulic pressure systems, atmospheric propulsion, water-driven lifts capable of moving entire rail cars. Switching mechanisms powered not by steam, but by controlled pressure. These weren't fringe theories. They were published, measured, tested, and then, suddenly, they stopped. After the late 1890s, the language disappears. No follow-up papers, no improvements, no debates. The entire field seems to vanish overnight. It was as if someone closed the book halfway through the story. And once you see that gap, you can't unsee it because the stations themselves are still standing. Silent, stripped of their original systems. Retrofitted, downgraded, but beneath the concrete and steel. The original geometry remains. Asterisk, asterisk. The deeper I went, the more the water systems stopped looking like support infrastructure and started looking like the main event. These weren't small pipes tucked away for emergencies. They were vast networks, deliberately placed at the core of the stations. Entire architectural decisions seemed to revolve around them. Platforms elevated above chambers. Floors suspended. Over reservoirs, walls thickened, not for strength alone, but to contain pressure, in London. Original subterranean maps revealed channels running far deeper than any fire suppression system would require. In Paris, sealed corridors beneath major stations extend outward like arteries, connecting to waterways long since rerouted or buried. In New York, early construction reports mention pressure vaults beneath platforms, a term that quietly disappears from later records without explanation. The official story insists these systems were secondary. But nothing about their scale supports that claim. What struck me most was the consistency. Different countries, different governments, different architects, yet the stations shared the same hidden logic. Water entered at controlled points. Pressure was regulated through chambers. Excess flow was redirected rather than discharged. It was systematic, intentional, and once again, the documents went silent right where the questions began. I started comparing early photographs more closely. Not just the buildings, but the activity inside them. The platforms weren't chaotic, they weren't noisy. People stood calmly beneath glass domes flooded with natural light. Trains arrived without clouds of smoke engulfing the space. Workers weren't covered in soot. The atmosphere felt controlled. That's when I noticed something subtle but unsettling. The stations didn't behave like steam-powered environments. Steam engines are loud. They leak, they vibrate, they stain everything around them. Yet many early stations show none of those signatures. Instead, they appear clean, quiet, almost serene, as if the dominant force moving the machinery wasn't combustion, but pressure. Pressure behaves differently. It's silent, invisible, predictable. Hydraulic systems don't announce themselves the way steam does. They don't scream, they don't billow. They move smoothly, efficiently, almost gracefully. And when you look at the infrastructure hidden beneath these stations, that's exactly what it seems designed for. Hydraulic lifts capable of raising rail cars. Turntables rotated without visible engines. Switching mechanisms embedded beneath floors rather than mounted above ground. Everything hidden. Everything integrated. It began to feel less like innovation and more like inheritance. The Victorians are credited with building these stations. But the more I studied the evidence, the more it seemed like they were adapting something older. Decorative elements, the statues, facades, clocks, and ornamentation clearly reflect 19th century taste. But the core systems, the geometry, the underground networks, those felt timeless, almost out of place. It's as if the builders were given a machine and told to make it look modern. That idea would sound absurd if it weren't for one glaring detail: the missing transition. Technologies don't vanish overnight. They evolve. They compete. They fail publicly. There should be debates, cost analyses, political fights, engineering journals arguing steam versus water. But when it comes to these stations, that transition is almost entirely absent. One decade, they operate cleanly and quietly. The next decade, everything is retrofitted for coal and steam. Channels are sealed, reservoirs drained, hydraulic equipment removed, and the buildings are recontextualized as purely industrial achievements of the steam age. No explanation. No controversy. Photographs from the early 1900s capture this moment with unsettling clarity. Workers are shown tearing out massive valves, valves far too large to belong to any fire system. Underground chambers are filled with rubble and concrete. Waterways are blocked. Access points are bricked up and forgotten. This wasn't modernization. It was removal, and what replaces it is objectively worse. Steam systems that blacken ceilings, coal smoke that chokes cities, noise that reverberates through once harmonious spaces. If efficiency were the goal, this makes no sense. If clean were the goal, it makes even less. Unless the original systems posed a problem. Water-powered infrastructure doesn't rely on constant fuel delivery. It doesn't require monopolized supply chains. It can't be easily taxed the same way coal can. It operates quietly, locally, independently. That kind of system is difficult to control. The thought is uncomfortable, but it keeps resurfacing. What if these stations weren't built to serve the industrial age at all? What if the industrial age was forced to adapt itself to them? That would explain the awkward fit. Steam engines shoehorned into spaces never designed for smoke. Ventilation added after the fact. Domes partially obscured. Acoustic properties ruined. Geometry compromised. The buildings survive, but their function is reduced. And then there's the global pattern. Why were the grandest stations always built beside rivers? Why were fountains positioned at entrances with direct underground connections? Why did so many stations share identical layouts despite being continents apart? Why do early engineering texts hint at atmospheric and hydraulic propulsion, only for those references to vanish entirely? Coincidence can explain one or two of these questions, but not all of them. That's when the name starts appearing, quietly, indirectly, almost apologetically. Tartaria. Not as a definitive answer, but as a placeholder. A label for something older, something forgotten, something we don't yet understand. Not a myth, not a fantasy empire. but the shadow of a civilization whose engineering principles don't fit neatly into our timeline. A world where architecture wasn't decoration, it was function, where buildings didn't consume energy. They guided it, where stations weren't terminals, they were nodes. And if that's true even partially, then the history we're taught isn't just incomplete. It's inverted. Asterisk, asterisk, once you recognize the pattern, it becomes impossible to ignore. The disappearance of these systems wasn't slow. It wasn't accidental. It didn't follow the natural arc of technological progress. It was abrupt, decisive, almost surgical. The water-powered infrastructure didn't fade out. It was removed. Photographs from the turn of the 20th century captured this moment with unsettling clarity. Stations that once gleamed with glass and light are suddenly wrapped in scaffolding. Workers tear open floors, not to repair them, but to gut them. Massive channels are exposed, then filled. Valves are disconnected. Chambers sealed. Entire underground networks vanish beneath layers of concrete and silence. And what replaces them is framed as progress. Steam becomes the hero of the age. Coal becomes the symbol of power. Smoke becomes proof of productivity. Every exhibition celebrates combustion. Every newspaper praises industry. And yet, the cities choke. Buildings blacken. Noise replaces harmony. Efficiency gives way to dependency. No one asks why. A clean, quiet, renewable system was abandoned. No one debates it. That silence is the loudest evidence of all. If these water-based systems were inferior, there would have been arguments. If they were inefficient, there would have been reports. If they failed, there would have been public disasters recorded. But there are none. Instead, there is a coordinated forgetting. Engineering texts simply stop mentioning them. Blueprints go missing. Access doors are locked and never reopened, and within a single generation. The knowledge disappears when later historians look back. They see only steam. They assume coal was always there. They assume the stations were designed around it. They never question why the buildings feel wrong for the machines inside them. But the buildings remember. The geometry remains. The proportions remain. The buried chambers remain. Even today, restorations occasionally uncover sealed tunnels beneath old stations. Rooms no one can explain. Shafts that lead nowhere. Channels that once carried water, but now carry nothing. When discovered, they are quietly documented, then reburied. Labeled as obsolete infrastructure. Forgotten again. And that raises the final question. If this technology was removed, not replaced, what threat did it pose? A water-powered transportation network doesn't require constant fuel extraction. It doesn't centralize power production. It doesn't depend on endless consumption. It simply exists, integrated into the environment. Operating in balance with it, such a system doesn't generate endless profit. It doesn't justify empires. It doesn't require control, and perhaps that is why it couldn't survive. The idea that the Victorians inherited something older becomes harder to dismiss the longer you look. The stations don't feel like inventions. They feel like adaptations, as if a previous civilization had already solved the hardest problems: energy, movement, harmony, and later societies merely repurposed what remained. Maybe they didn't understand it fully. Maybe they couldn't maintain it. Or maybe they understood it all too well. Because once you accept the possibility that the past was more advanced in certain ways than we are today, the entire narrative of progress collapses. History stops looking like a straight line upward. It starts looking like a cycle: rise, peak, collapse, inheritance, and the grand stations of the 19th century may not represent the birth of modern transportation at all. They may represent the final echoes of a world that knew how to build differently. A world that used water, geometry, pressure, and resonance as one unified system. Not machines we powered, but structures that powered themselves. If that world existed, even partially, then we are not living at the height of technological achievement. We are living among its ruins, and maybe that's why these buildings feel the way they do. Why they inspire awe instead of nostalgia. Why they feel alive even when stripped of their purpose. Because they were never meant to be monuments. They were meant to function, and somewhere beneath our cities, sealed behind concrete and forgotten records, the evidence still waits. Asterisk, asterisk, if this story has shifted the way you see the past, stay with this series, because this isn't the end. It's the beginning of a deeper investigation into the technologies that vanished without explanation and the civilization's history chose to forget. Once you see the pattern, you can't unsee it. And the next discoveries will change the way you look at the modern world itself. Asterisk.